All right, diving in today, folks, to a really intense period in Spanish history.
Yeah.
We're going from dictatorship to republic, coups, uprisings, you name it.
Yeah, it's a lot.
All happening between, 1923, right? To the mid-30s.
Yep, 1936.
Okay, so we've got a stack of your sources here.
All right.
Historical stuff, pronouncements from the dictators themselves, even viewpoints from those early days of the Second Republic.
That's good.
So, listeners, our aim is to make this era clear, break it down. We're looking for the key events, the reasons they happened, and most importantly, how it all connects. No information overload, though. We're going for insightful and hopefully a bit entertaining.
Right.
This was a time when Spain's political system was, incredibly fragile.
Absolutely.
Social unrest was simmering everywhere, and ultimately, the entire way the country was run transformed.
It's crucial to grasp what was happening before the Republic if you really want to understand it.
Okay, so let's go back to that.
Okay.
1923, the Restoration system, it's on its last legs.
It was.
Then comes Miguel Primo de Rivera, stages a coup, and King Alfonso III pretty much just accepts it.
He does.
So not exactly a shock, right? This was years in the making.
Yeah, years of problems building up.
All right, help us untangle this a bit. Why was the Restoration system so vulnerable that a military takeover could just, happen? And the king barely puts up a fight.
Well, you can almost picture it like a building, but with all these cracks, structurally unsound.
Okay, I like that.
One big crack, the king himself. Alfonso III wasn't just a figurehead.
Right.
He meddled in politics a lot, and he really liked the military.
Oh, he was known for that.
Then there's the Turno de Partidos.
Right, that system where the conservatives and liberals took turns?
Yeah, except by 1923, it was a total mess. 23 coalition governments in 5 years. Can you imagine?
Total gridlock. And you've already got these social tensions brewing.
Exactly. The 1917 crisis, that was still having an effect. And the Trienio Bolshevik showed how divided things were. Labor unrest, strikes.
And, of course, the pistolerism.
Right, violence between employers and workers. Cities were just chaotic.
And we can't forget the army. After that defeat in the Moroccan War at Annual in 1921.
Oh, they were humiliated. Morale was terrible.
So we've got a king getting involved where he maybe shouldn't, a political system that's basically frozen, huge social divisions, people are struggling economically, and then the army's feeling defeated.
Yeah, that's the perfect recipe for someone to just take over.
So that's where Primo de Rivera comes in.
He does.
September 1923, Captain General of Catalonia, he launches his coup right there in Barcelona.
Yeah, it's a bold move.
He takes over communications, declares martial law, and he puts out this manifesto al país y al ejército españoles, a direct appeal to the country and the army.
It is.
What did he say? What was he promising?
Essentially, it boils down to this. Spain is in a bad state, all thanks to the professional politicians, those guys running things since, 1898, the disaster there.
Losing the colonies.
Right. So Primo de Rivera, he says a military government is the solution, but he makes it very clear he's loyal to King Alfonso III.
Interesting.
Promises to end the chaos, no more violence, no more strikes, and he specifically goes after the nationalists, especially the Catalans.
Bold move.
And of course, the big one. A quick and honorable end to the Moroccan War.
A lot of promises.
It was.
So the king, Alfonso III, he wasn't even there when this all went down.
No, he was away.
So how does he react to this military rebellion?
The government at the time, Garcia Prieto was leading it, they begged the king to condemn the coup, uphold the Constitution.
Right.
But Alfonso III, he hesitates. And in the end, he doesn't side with the legal government.
He doesn't.
No, he hands the reins to Primo de Rivera.
Wow. Okay, to go along with a coup like that.
Mm-hmm.
Historians must have had a field day with this one.
Oh, they have. It's still debated. Why would he do that?
What are some of the theories?
Well, we know the king was close to the military. Maybe he thought they were the only ones who could, fix things.
That Iron Surgeon idea, like Joaquin Costa talked about.
Yeah, exactly. And Alfonso III had a habit of, getting involved in politics.
Right.
So maybe he saw Primo de Rivera as, his way of cleaning up the mess.
He felt he couldn't do it himself.
Maybe. And let's not forget the disaster in Morocco, Annual. The public wanted that war to end, and there was the whole Picasso investigation going on, potentially very damaging.
Right.
Then you've got the backdrop of the Russian Revolution. Republicanism was on the rise, so maybe the king was, well, scared.
Scared for his throne.
Yeah, he saw the coup as a way to, get ahead of a bigger threat.
Stop a more radical change from happening.
Exactly. And you have to remember the political system was completely broken. The Turno was dead. Parties were split. No clear leadership anywhere.
So, in a weird way, the coup.
It was the easiest option.
Okay, so the coup happens, the king backs it. But what about everyone else? The Spanish people, did they just roll over and accept this?
It's interesting. It wasn't an immediate no from everyone. Some groups actually liked it, or at least didn't fight back right away.
Who are we talking about?
Well, the church, the army, they liked the idea of order being restored.
Right, that makes sense.
And the industrialists, those running the big businesses, they were worried about all the labor unrest, so they saw Primo de Rivera as, well, a solution to that.
Stability at any cost.
Yeah, pretty much. But I think the biggest factor was a big chunk of the population, ordinary people, they were just tired. Tired of the instability, the chaos, the political fighting.
So they were willing to try anything new.
Yeah. Even if it meant losing some freedoms, they just wanted things to be, normal again. And the politicians who'd been kicked out, they didn't have strong leaders to organize any real opposition.
What about the socialists, the anarchists?
They kind of took a wait-and-see approach at first. Even the press was mostly okay with it.
So who was speaking out against it?
Mostly intellectuals, writers, thinkers. Like Miguel de Unamuno.
Oh, he was a big critic.
He was, and Ramon Perez de Ayala, those types.
Okay, so Primo de Rivera's in charge. That first period of his rule, it's called the Military Directorate.
Right, from 1923 to 1925.
What was it like? How did he actually govern?
Straight up authoritarian rule. Military all the way.
Yeah.
That first government, in September 1923, all military men. And when the presidents of the Congress and the Senate, those guys were, I think, Milquiades Alvarez and the Count of Romanón.
Right.
They tried to remind the king about the whole, constitutional need to call the Cortes together.
The parliament.
Primo de Rivera just ignored them.
They did.
Completely. Dismissed them both, and then he dissolved all the parliamentary commissions. That was his way of saying the Constitution, well, it didn't really matter anymore.
So what did the king do?
Well, Alfonso III, he basically told Romanones, look, peace and order come first. We'll worry about the Constitution and the Cortes later. And to really make it clear what direction they were going in, on a trip to Italy, he introduces Primo de Rivera to Mussolini as my Mussolini. Yeah. And Mussolini even calls Primo de Rivera the head of Spanish fascism.
Okay, so that's a pretty clear message about where things are going.
It is.
And the whole administration is completely militarized, right?
Absolutely. Primo de Rivera was basically a one-man show, the sole minister. The only other requirement was the king's signature, and the rest of the government were just military guys called vocales.
Vocales.
Yeah, basically members, not real ministers with any power. They suspended the 1876 Constitution. The Cortes never met. And all the civilian governors out in the provinces, they were replaced by military officers.
So this went all the way down to the local level.
Oh, yeah. Town councils, they were gone. Instead, you had these delegados gubernativos, military men running things. And at the local level, councils were replaced with these military vocales asociados.
Vocales asociados.
Yeah, basically military guys working with local bigwigs. They eventually set up these juntas de vocales asociados, boards with important local people, supposedly to help run things, but they were still under the control of the military. And they clamped down on freedoms, meetings, associations, banned.
So no more political parties or labor unions.
Gone. And they brought back censorship of the press. They even had this decree, the decree of incompatibilities, to stop former ministers from making money off of government contracts.
So a real crackdown. But what about Primo de Rivera's whole regeneracionista agenda, the reforms he promised? What did that actually look like?
Well, his regeneration was basically a very simplified, very authoritarian version of that Iron Surgeon idea from Joaquin Costa.
Right.
He was obsessed with ending social unrest. So he outlawed the big labor organizations, the CNT, the PCE.
The anarchists and the communists.
Right. And any hint of opposition was met with military force.
And what about the Catalan nationalists?
Oh, they were a huge target. He banned anything that even looked like Catalan nationalism, the flag, the language, even in schools and churches. And in 1925, he dissolved the Mancomunidad Catalana, their autonomous government.
A major step backwards for Catalan autonomy.
It was. And beyond that, he tried to impose a sort of, social order, tight regulations on civil servants. He wanted to promote things like physical exercise, traditional values, that sort of thing.
Sounds a bit like, a very specific vision of what Spain should be.
It was. He created this organization, the Union Patriotica, in 1924. It was basically a single party under his control. Their slogan was religion, homeland, and freedom.
Catchy.
It was mostly just a way to spread government propaganda, but by 1925 it had, get this, 2 million members.
Brilliant.
Yeah. And he also tried to fix the old problem of corruption, at the local level.
Right, the caciquismo.
Exactly. He put Jose Calvo Sotelo in charge of drafting this new law, the Estatuto Municipal, in 1924. It was supposed to get rid of those local political bosses and make elections fairer. They even wanted to give women the vote.
That's interesting.
Yeah. But these new elections, they never happened, so the Estatuto Municipal never really went anywhere.
A good idea on paper, maybe.
Perhaps. But there was one area where Primo de Rivera, well, he actually did pretty well, and that was Morocco.
Right. The war that just wouldn't end.
Exactly. After the attack on Zawen in 1924, he decided to get more involved. And the key here, he teamed up with France.
Interesting.
Yeah, they were both having trouble in Morocco.
Oh.
Abdelkrim was causing all sorts of problems. So they launched this big operation, the Al Husaymas landing in 1925. Land, sea, air, the whole thing.
It's worked.
Big success. It led to Abdelkrim surrendering. And for Primo de Rivera, it was a huge boost. His popularity went up, and so did the prestige of some of his generals, guys like Sanjuro and, well, Franco. Yep. So after this victory in Morocco, things change a bit. We enter the Civil Directorate from 1925 to 1930.
What was different?
Well, they brought in some civilians to help run things.
So not just military men anymore.
Right. Calvo Sotelo, he was in charge of finances, and Eduardo Anos was running the Ministry of Labor. But they kept some key military figures in place. Martínez Anido, he was the vice president and minister of governance.
So a bit of a mixed bag.
Yeah. One interesting thing they did was create this Somatin Nacional, a civilian militia, but they were under the control of the army.
What was that for?
Basically, to keep things calm, maintain order, but without having soldiers everywhere.
Interesting.
And they tried to, well, make the regime more official.
How so?
In 1927, Primo de Rivera sets up this National Consultative Assembly. It was 400 people, handpicked by the government, bureaucrats, people from the Union Patriotica, professionals, that sort of thing.
And what was their job?
To write a new constitution, a brand new one.
Did it work?
Not really. Their draft, the one they came up with in 1929, it was a mess. It didn't even mention national sovereignty or separation of powers, and it gave way too much power to the king. People hated it, and it just, well, it fizzled out.
So that didn't really help legitimize the regime?
Not at all. And during the Civil Directorate period, the crackdown on regional nationalism, especially in Catalonia, it didn't let up.
It didn't.
No. They dissolved the Mancomunidad, changed street names, banned the Catalan flag. They even closed down Barcelona's football stadium and suspended this big Catalan choral society for a while for being, well, too Catalan.
Wow. And ironically,
It just made Catalan nationalism stronger. It pushed them more to the left. For Ignatius Macià, he became a real symbol of resistance. Although it's worth noting that the Catalan business class, they mostly supported Primo de Rivera.
why is that?
They liked the stability, and the economy was doing well, at least for some. But the Civil Directorate, they did do some things for workers and in education, even if they were still cracking down on regionalism.
What kinds of things?
Martínez Anido, he set up this organization, the Organización Corporativa Nacional, and these joint committees with workers, employers, and government folks all together to try and solve labor problems.
So more of a negotiated approach.
Yeah. And Largo Caballero, the socialist leader, he actually supported the system.
Interesting.
They also made some improvements to working conditions, help for retirees and big families, rules about women working at night, and they built some affordable housing. In education, they built more schools, tried to get rid of illiteracy, paid teachers better, and gave them more training.
Sounds positive.
Yeah. But of course, academic freedom was still restricted, and a lot of the teaching was very, very traditional, very Catholic, and patriotically Spanish.
Of course. And this was all happening during the Roaring '20s, when Spain's economy was doing pretty well, right?
Yeah. Calvo Sotelo, the finance minister, he really believed in the state having a strong role in the economy.
What did that look like in practice?
More tariffs, protectionism. They also created these big state monopolies like Camp PSA for oil and the National Telephone Company, and a ton of spending on public works projects, building roads, dams, ports, you name it. This was partly to deal with unemployment.
Makes sense?
Yeah, some of the big projects were the National Circuit of Special Surfaces, thousands of kilometers of new roads, and these hydrographic confederations that this guy Lorenzo Pardo designed. It was all about better managing water for irrigation and to generate electricity. And they even hosted those big international expositions in Seville and Barcelona in 1929.
To show off a bit.
Yeah, show that Spain was, modern and back on track. And you know what else they created in 1929?
What's that?
The Liga de Futbol Professional.
No way.
The first division of Spanish football.
So everything was great then.
Not so fast. All this spending, it wasn't really paid for.
Right.
They have this big budget deficit, and they didn't reform the tax system to make up for it.
So when the 1929 crash hit,
Spain was in trouble, foreign capital left, businesses closed, unemployment shot up. And people who'd been okay with Primo de Rivera, well, they weren't so happy anymore. Even King Alfonso XIII started to distance himself.
he could see which way the wind was blowing.
Exactly.
So all these problems, opposition is building, but how did it actually play out? Who were the main players?
Well, on the right, even some monarchists were getting fed up with the dictatorship and with the king.
Like who?
People like Niceto Alcalá Zamora, Miguel Mara, they actually ended up moving towards republicanism.
Interesting.
Yeah. And on the left, the Republicans were getting stronger. You had moderate figures like Alejandro Lerroux, but a more left-wing republicanism was emerging as well around Manuel Azaña.
And the Catalan nationalists.
Oh, they were active. Francesc Macià, he led this failed uprising from exile in France. Yeah. It didn't work out. But it did lead to the creation of Esquerra Republicana de Catalunya in 1931, a new, more radical Catalan nationalist party. And then you had the anarchists organizing underground. In 1927, they founded the FAI, the Federación Anarquista Ibérica. They were all about, revolution.
So a lot of different groups with different goals, all united against Primo de Rivera.
Yeah, but they weren't all working together. Not yet.
And what about the army? They had been Primo de Rivera's base of support.
Yeah, but cracks were starting to show there, too.
How so?
Well, there was this attempted coup in 1926, the Sanjuanada, led by a General Aguilera. It didn't go anywhere.
What happened?
It was quickly put down. Then the artillery corps got upset about a new promotion system. They felt it was unfair, so Primo de Rivera forced the king to disband the entire corps.
Wow, that's extreme.
Yeah, and that created a lot of resentment. More and more officers started to turn away from both the dictatorship and the king. Some even started thinking about republicanism. Yeah. And then, in 1929, there was another uprising, led by a conservative general, Sanchez Guerra. It also failed.
So even within the military, there was this growing sense that things weren't right.
Exactly. And another interesting development, the universities became real centers of opposition.
The university.
Yeah. Even with all the limits on free speech, that's where people could still speak their minds. Big intellectuals like José Ortega y Gasset, Vicente Blasco Ibáñez, Fernando de los Ríos, they all criticized the regime.
And of course, Miguel de Unamuno.
Oh, yeah. He was kicked out of his job and sent into exile for speaking out.
Exile.
Yeah. And in 1929, they tried to reform the universities to make public and private university degrees equal.
Yeah.
But it caused these huge student protests led by the FUE, the Student Federation. The government cracked down, things got violent, and it just made things worse. They even attacked the offices of newspapers like ABC and El Debate. And in the end, they had to close some universities down entirely.
So the situation was becoming more and more unstable.
It was. And then, of course, you have the crash of 1929. That really changed everything.
Yeah, how did that affect things in Spain?
Well, maybe it wasn't as bad as in some other places, but it still hurt. Foreign investors pulled out, businesses closed, unemployment went up, and people had less money to spend. And remember those big public works projects?
Yeah.
Well, they left a big hole in the budget. Spain was in debt.
So the economic crisis made everything worse.
Exactly. People were unhappy, and they started to blame Primo de Rivera.
So by the end of the 1920s, he's facing opposition from all sides.
He is. Politicians, intellectuals, the military, even the king. He's also sick, and he's just, tired of it all.
So what happens?
He resigns January 30th, 1930, goes into exile in Paris, and he dies a few months later.
So that's the end of Primo de Rivera.
It is.
But his resignation, that just created a whole new set of problems, right?
Yeah. Now, the king was seen as the problem. He was the one who'd gone along with the coup, who'd supported Primo de Rivera all along.
Before we move on to what happened next, let's go back to that manifesto.
Okay.
The one Primo de Rivera issued when he took over.
The Al País y el Ejército Españoles.
Right. What were his main arguments? What was his justification for this coup?
Well, he really went after the politicians, blamed them for everything, said they'd been messing things up since 1898, since Spain lost the colonies. He even said that patriotic Spaniards were begging to be freed from these politicians.
He painted a pretty bleak picture.
He did. He talked about all the social unrest, the terrorism, the disaster in Morocco. It was all the politicians' fault, according to him.
And his solutions.
Well, he said the military would restore order, they'd fix the problem in Morocco, and he was careful to say he was loyal to the king, at least at first.
So back to 1930. Primo de Rivera's gone, and the king is trying to pick up the pieces.
Yeah. Alfonso III appoints General Berenguer to lead a new government. This was January 1930.
And this is what they called the dicta blanda, right? The soft dictatorship.
Exactly. The idea was to ease back into a more constitutional system, but, the king still wanted the military to have a big role.
He hadn't really learned his lesson.
It seems not. So Berenger, he brings back the 1876 Constitution, restores some basic freedoms, but he delays calling the Cortes back into session. He governs by decree.
So not exactly a full return to democracy.
No. But the problem was, going back to the way things were before 1923, well, that just wasn't possible anymore.
Why not?
Spanish society had changed, especially in the cities. Republican sentiment was growing. People weren't going to accept the old system, the turno, and all that caciquismo.
So the king's attempt to turn back the clock was doomed to fail.
Pretty much. And it wasn't just the Republicans, even some of Primo de Rivera's old supporters. They formed this new party, Union Monárquica Nacional, and they actually wanted to keep some form of authoritarian rule.
Wow. So they were basically saying the dictatorship was a good thing.
Well, they felt Spain needed a strong hand, but on the other side, you had this really interesting group coming together.
Who's that?
They called it the Pacto de San Sebastián. It was this coalition of all sorts of different figures.
Like who?
Well, you had former monarchists who turned Republican, like Alcalá Zamora and Miguel Mara.
Okay.
Then you had Republicans like Alejandro Lerroux, he was more moderate, and Manuel Azaña, who was more to the left.
And what about the socialists?
Yeah, they were there too. Big names like Indalecio Prieto and Fernando de los Rios.
So quite a diverse group. What did they want?
They all agreed on one thing. Spain needed to be a republic. They even set up this revolutionary committee to plan a military uprising to make it happen. They knew that just relying on elections might not be enough.
So this is August 1930.
Right. And the pact, it started to gain real momentum. The PSOE, the Socialist Party, and the UGT, their trade union, they joined. And so did intellectuals from Ortega y Gasset's group, the Agrupación al Servicio de la República.
Ortega y Gasset, the philosopher.
Yeah. He was a big critic of the monarchy. In fact, he wrote this famous essay, El Error Berenguer, where he basically said, the monarchy must be destroyed. He even used the Latin phrase, delenda est monarchia.
Wow, so things were really heating up.
Yeah. And remember how some military officers had started to distance themselves from the king?
Right.
Well, some of them actually started supporting the Republicans.
Secretly.
Yeah, they had to be careful. But there were these uprisings. In December 1930, there was one in Jaca, led by these two captains, Galan and Garcia Hernandez.
What happened?
It failed. They were caught and executed. And there was another one in Cuatro Vientos involving General Queipo de Llano and Commander Ramon Franco, Franco's brother. That one failed too.
So Republicans were getting bolder, more willing to use force.
They were.
Wow.
And the government, they arrested the members of the Revolutionary Committee. But there was so much public pressure that they had to give them pretty light sentences.
So the monarchy was losing control.
Yeah. And then comes Admiral Aznar's government in January 1931.
Well, what was the plan?
He formed this national unity government, brought in people from the old monarchist parties.
A last-ditch effort.
You could say that. His big idea was to hold municipal elections, local elections, on April 12th, 1931. He said they would be a lead-up to general elections.
So the monarchists figured they could control things at the local level.
That was the hope. They still had a lot of influence in the rural areas through caciquismo.
But the Republicans, they weren't going to play that game, were they?
No. They saw these elections as a chance to show that people wanted a republic, a sort of referendum on the monarchy.
I see.
The Republicans and Socialists, they formed this coalition, the Conjunción Republicana, to fight the elections.
And how did it go?
Well, overall, the monarchists won more councillors, but that was mostly in the rural areas.
Where they could still manipulate things.
Exactly. But in the cities, it was a different story. The Conjunción Republicana won big in 41 of the 50 provincial capitals. Huge victories in places like Madrid and Barcelona.
So the cities were clearly pro-republic.
Yeah. And the Republicans said this showed that people wanted a change. They said the urban votes were free from caciquismo.
And this led directly to the fall of the monarchy, right?
Yeah. On April 14th, 1931, this little town in the Basque Country, Eibar, they declared the Second Republic. And other cities quickly followed. People took to the streets.
And what about the king?
The Count of Romanones, he went to the king and said, look, it's over. You don't have the support anymore. And General Sanjurjo, the head of the civil guard, he told the king that his men wouldn't fire on the crowds.
So Alfonso III had no choice.
He didn't want a civil war. So he decided to go into exile, left from Cartagena on April 14th and 15th.
And the Second Republic was born.
Just like that.
There's that famous quote, isn't there? About how Spain went to bed a monarchy and woke up a republic?
Yeah, that was Admiral Aznar. He said, España se ha acostado monárquica y se ha levantado republicana.
So the republic is proclaimed, and this provisional government takes over.
Mm-hmm.
It's made up of all those different groups that signed the Pacto de San Sebastian.
Right, it was quite a mix.
You had former monarchists who'd become Republicans, like Alcalá Zamora and Mora, and moderate Republicans like Leroux and Martínez Barrio.
Yeah, and more intellectual Republicans like Domingo and Albornoz and Azaña, of course.
Socialists like De los Rios and Largo Caballero and Prieto, and even nationalists like Dolwer from Catalonia and Casares Quiroga from Galicia.
Quite the group.
And they immediately had two big problems to deal with.
Yeah, right off the bat.
Catalan nationalism and the religious question.
Two huge issues.
So first, Catalan nationalism.
The very same day the Republic was declared in Madrid, Francesc Macià goes and proclaims,